Hi everyone, I'm back, and now let's talk about tips for your virtual interview. If you're interviewing for medical school, residency, fellowship, whatever it might be, or even a job, most interviews, and hopefully all interviews, are going to be virtual during the COVID-19 pandemic. That said, there are a lot of things about a virtual interview that are different than a live in-person interview, and so I'm hoping the next 10 tips that I give you will be helpful for acing your virtual interview. If you haven't already, take a look at the other video I already shot on the top 10 generic interview tips, and hopefully that will be helpful as a starting place. But today I wanted to zero in on the virtual interviews that you'll be doing for this upcoming season. So let's get started. Tip number 1, let's talk lighting. So for a virtual interview, it's really important that you position yourself and your camera in a place where you're going to be seen in a good light. Hopefully the lighting that you see right now that I'm using is appropriate. A lot of people who might shoot a lot of videos or do a lot of video conferencing actually have a ring light. If you just buy it online at Amazon, the cost of a ring light is not too bad. We're talking usually less than $50. That said, I'm a cheapskate and I actually don't shoot that many videos, and so I never have used a ring light. For me, what's been really helpful is sitting across from an open window with natural light. That's also to say that when you are sitting in for your interview, don't sit with an open window behind you. That will make you backlit. When you're backlit, it's just a lot harder to make out your facial expressions and what you're trying to say, so try to avoid it if you can. Another thing that's kind of related to lighting that I wanted to touch on is how to frame yourself. Make sure that you're sitting in the frame so that you fill up most of the frame, and generally in the center. A lot of people end up putting the video so that their head is kind of right in the middle of the shot. But it's a little bit nicer if your head almost touches the top of the frame. That way you can fill up more of the actual screen for your interviewer. The other thing is that if you are big into gesticulation, then this way it makes it a little bit easier for your interviewer to actually see your hand gestures. Otherwise, if you do everything down here, all they see are your shoulders moving and they can't really see much more than that. Tip number 2, let's talk audio. There's certainly no need to go out and buy anything expensive like a microphone. I actually think it's perfectly fine to use a microphone that's perhaps on a set of earphones that you can plug in. The other thing that I'd suggest is thinking about Bluetooth earphones. The one suggestion I have to avoid is perhaps avoiding the actual built-in microphone on your computer or on your device, whatever you're using, specifically if you're in an empty room that echoes a lot, because that just makes it a lot more distracting. The other thing is a personal preference thing. I personally would not use those headsets that a lot of people are wearing right now for Zoom calls. It looks a little bit like you're working at a call center, which if that's how you have to do your interview, that's totally fine. But if you have the ability to, I would certainly use some Bluetooth earphones, or even wired earphones would be great too with a microphone attached. Sometimes you might find that the built-in microphone is just fine, especially if you aren't in a very echoey room. So for example, I'm using the built-in microphone for my iPhone as I film this, and I think that audio is just fine this way. Most importantly, for lighting and for audio, make sure you practice with a friend so that they can talk you through some of the shortcomings of perhaps your video, which might be the most helpful thing to do before your actual interview. Tip number 3 for your virtual interview is to use a computer and angle down at yourself. Computers nowadays all pretty much come with a built-in camera, and it's really nice if you can set it on a high enough platform so that it's at least even with your line of sight, or at least angles down towards you, just because if it angles up, it's a little bit more of an unflattering view. And why not give yourself the best camera shot possible? Let's be honest, no one really wants to see this view of me. One other nice thing about a computer, it's gonna stay there, it's sturdy, you're not gonna have your phone or tablet just slipping off whatever you're using to prop it up, and so for that reason, I do think it's a little bit more stable. The other thing that's honestly kind of nice about that is that for some reason you need to look something up secretly, you can kind of be typing on your computer at the same time, hopefully in a discreet way so you can pull something up if you need to. Tip number 4, wear pants or a skirt. It's that simple. Just don't be that guy or girl who shows up to your interview wearing nothing on the bottom and then having to stand up for some reason during your interview. It's a good idea just to dress as you normally would for your interview, even though it's virtual. Why risk it? Just put on your dress pants or your dress skirt. I think that would probably be the safest thing to do. I would also say that getting completely dressed up might actually put you in more of an interview mood/vibe, and that might be helpful for you as you think about your next step in your professional career. Tip number 5, choose your background carefully. I personally would suggest that you don't use a virtual background. I find virtual backgrounds to be a little bit distracting, especially if you end up blending into the background. And sometimes if you're trying to show something, like if you had a piece of paper or something next to you that you want to show to your interviewer, You have to hold it in a particular way for it to show up. Otherwise, it just blends into the background. And so instead of a virtual background, I think it's great to actually spend some time to think about where you're going to sit, what's going to be displayed behind you. The other thing I would suggest about your real background, try to avoid a very cluttered background. Remember that the background you choose actually sends a message about you. If your background has a painting that's hanging, or maybe has a picture from a prior trip, your interviewer may pick up on that and actually ask you questions about it. So this is actually kind of a cool way where you can control the information that the interviewer gets about you just from looking at your background. It's always fine to have a totally clean wall behind you. If you do have to choose a wall where you have something hanging in the background, just be ready to answer questions about it. Certainly make sure that you clean up the space around you. So for example, you're seeing my living room behind me, so I made sure to pick up everything off the ground so you wouldn't see anything cluttered, like my kids' toys. But the point is that take some extra effort to make sure that the space that you're interviewing in is clean so that that can't be a possible detractor from your interview. Tip number 6, and this one's pretty simple. Get to a place with stable Wi-Fi. It's really, really hard to recover from an interview where you're coming in and out, where your video is kind of spotty and freezing in different frames. And so if you're able to get to a place with very stable Wi-Fi, that would be great. I know that right now is difficult because a lot of us are working from home, but if you have access to high-speed internet as a part of a college, a university, a hospital, whatever that might be, think about using it if your Wi-Fi and your network is not that stable at home. This is another great place to definitely practice with a friend beforehand, because they can definitely help you troubleshoot to see if your connection is good enough for your interview. The other thing I would suggest that's related to this is to have a backup option. What if you're doing your interview at home, which is normally completely stable from a connection perspective, but all of a sudden you start to lose your access, you start to lose the ability to have a stable connection? The other thing that I always worry about is what if you have a technical difficulty with the computer you're about to use? Make sure you have a backup option. Maybe it's your cell phone, maybe it's a tablet. It doesn't have to be a computer because most of us don't own 2 computers. But the point I'm trying to make is definitely have a plan B, just in case something happens. Tip number 7, set your computer to do not disturb and close any app or any website that's going to cause a sound. So for example, I always turn off all my notifications to do not disturb when I'm on a Zoom call, just because I don't really want people knowing that I'm receiving text messages at the same time. The other thing is that my Outlook account will always ding when I get a new email message, so I'm always careful to close that down before any important meetings or important talks as well. So go to the effort of doing that before your interview, just so that you're not interrupted with any of those annoying sounds. Tip number 8, look at the camera when you're answering the question. With virtual interviews, it's really easy for us to divert our attention off to the side where you're just kind of staring at a video of yourself talking back to you. But I think unfortunately the message that sends is that you're not making direct eye contact with your interviewer. One thing that I'll sometimes do, which helps remind me of this, is I'll actually hit the minimize button on Zoom, which closes everything down to a really small window. Then I'll move that little window right under the camera on my computer. Even if I'm just looking down at that little window, it still comes across like I'm looking straight into the camera, which really helps me with the eye contact piece. Remember though, if you're staring right at the camera, you can't really read the body language of the person that you're talking to, which is why you do have to glance back at the person that you're speaking with every so often. When the other person's talking, I also think it's a great time to be looking straight at their video so that you can get a sense of what they're trying to explain, including their body language. Tip number 9, be early. Since you're gonna be interviewing from home or wherever you decide to actually have your interviews and there's no travel involved, it's critically important that you're not late for your interviews. You don't have an excuse to be late because all the reasons for running late really don't exist anymore. Log into those Zoom calls a couple minutes early. You just don't ever want to be the person that's leaving your interviewer waiting for you. And finally, tip number 10, and this is probably the one that's the most obvious, find a quiet place to interview where you won't be interrupted. I think it's really important to realize that we all have lives. Many of you might be parents and you have little kids running around, but this is the time, if you can, to get other people to watch the kids, to get other people ready to let the plumber in if you're expecting someone to come fix the sink. The point is that you really want to be there 100% for your interview. And so you want to pick a time, pick a place where people aren't going to be walking around behind you or interrupting you at some point during your interview. I know this kind of seems like a no-brainer, but realize that this is a very unique situation. With traditional interviews when you're in person, you're not anywhere near home where people can interrupt you. So now all of a sudden there's this new variable that you really have to be conscientious about when you're planning out your interviews. Those are my 10 tips for virtual interviews. I hope you found them to be helpful. If you have any other tips, I'd love it if you could share them down below in the comment section so that people who watch this video can also review your comments for some extra information. Please like below if you found that this video is helpful for you as you continue your interview journey on your medical career. And definitely, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you find that the stuff I'm sharing here is helpful for you in general. Thank you so much for joining me today. Together with my earlier video on generic interview tips and today's video on virtual interviews, I'm hoping that this will give you a leg up for all your interviews this coming season. Good luck to all of you. See you later.